Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Right to Reason Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley, and this is episode 21. This is also the longest episode I think we've ever done. I don't know, maybe the R and Raw one topped it, but I don't think so. Our guest today is famous Christian apologist Blake Giunta. And guys, I gotta tell you, it gets pretty heavy. You've all heard me debate lots of people, pastors, rectors, esotericists, 9/11 truthers, creationists, you name it, but usually I'm the aggressor. I'm on the offense, not with Blake. No. He kept me on my heels the whole time. If you like really deep epistemological discussion, you're about to have your fill. You ready?
And I think it should be religion treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt. And I claim that right.
And let me assure you that we are going to take our fight for economic justice, for social justice, for environmental sanity, for a world of peace.
We very naturally, as a cognitive and behavioral imperative, we form descriptions of the world and we try to figure out what's going on.
The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Hey, this is Blake Giunta. I'm a Christian apologist, but I am glad you're here because you have the right to reason.
Oh, and just one more thing. Since Blake and I go back and forth for about 2.5 hours straight, I thought I would skip any other segments. My shows are usually longer than the typical podcast anyway, and I didn't want to overload you guys, so there's no topic, GG spot, special guest trivia, musical interviews, nothing. Just straight, unrelenting, raw logic and debate. Blake Giunta has a very particular formula that he uses against atheists, and it's not from the shallow end of the pool, kiddos. I do my best to hold the torch, as it were. He's seen me debate before, so he knew to keep me off balance. But you know what Blake wasn't counting on when he was keeping me in the defensive position throughout? I'm just as good on my back. Wait, that came out wrong. Whatever. Let's get started, bitches.
Culture is not your friend. Culture is for other people's convenience and the convenience of various institutions, churches, companies.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Who based the design of rockets on science? They reached the moon. It works. Bitches.
They hate you. They hate prosperity. They hate God. They hate children. And goddamn them there. We're going to find the lever to beat these people, and they're going to be beaten. Look at her shark face. Have to look at her with that demon face. That's a frickin' demon. We're going to have President Linda Blair, people, and I'm not going to go along with it.
We are not our past, and that's the whole power of logic and reason, is finding out that you can only exist in this present moment. The past is already done. The only thing that the past gives you is either the ability to blame yourself with regret and guilt and shame, or the ability to use the past as an arsenal to get done what you want to do. You have to ask yourself what you really want.
I want to give up.
Well, you're not giving up.
Hi, this is Kelly Clements from the Areopagus Project. Robert Stanley is my polar opposite, but we both have the right to reason.
No more should the Republicans ignore this growing threat. No more should the left be divided or take half measures. No racism, no white supremacy, no xenophobia, no bigotry, no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA.
How am I supposed to talk to you people if we don't believe the same thing?
But don't you see, you've already taken the first step, the hardest step. You're listening.
This is Jason Camo from A Lost State of Mind, and you're listening to The Right to Reason.
If you feel the right to reason and the conversations we have on this podcast to be valuable, then please know that while this broadcast is provided to you for free, it is not free to produce. Please visit my Patreon page. It's easy to remember. It's patreon.com/right. There are multiple rewards available to all patrons, even those of you that contribute just $1. You can also find the link on my website at therighttoreason.com. If you are able to make this show possible, know that your support contributes to getting the message you care about out to those that may not have heard it. Those of you that are already helping, know that we are creating this production together. All my listeners are part of this show, but those that support it are facilitators that are turning our whisper into a resounding message in the marketplace of ideas. If you think this show is worth $1 or even more, visit patreon.com/right. And we are back. I am really excited to be talking to Blake Giunta today. Blake is a Christian apologist, co-director of Reasonable Faith at UT in Dallas, and founder of, this one's interesting, I really want to ask you about this, BeliefMap.org. It's an interactive online encyclopedia which aims to provide users with academically respected points in the debate over God's existence as well as Jesus' resurrection. He's been researching these topics exhaustively for, like 12 years now, 10 years, something like that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Long time. He's debated lots of people. Some people I'm sure you guys recognize from guests that have been on our show, like Matt Dillahunty. In fact, I think you talked to Matt a few times, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I've been with him on Dogma Debate. We've had another podcast that we were on together, and then we had 3 formal debates.
So, Blake, really happy to have you, man. I got to start off with something I'm a little embarrassed to admit. I can tell you're a pretty open guy just from what I've seen you and other debates and conversations and podcasts. I'm going to be open with you. I like to put out on those social media webs and all that kind of thing of, hey, this is what's coming up. Just keep everybody updated with what I'm doing. And whenever I told them I was debating Kent Hovind and then told them I was debating Blake Giunta, I got the exact same response, but it's kind of funny for completely different reasons. When I told them I was debating Kent, like people like Aaron Rod, like Matt you were just talking about, and Michael Shermer, and you Daryl Ray. I mean, all the people that we would recognize their names. They're all like, "Don't do it. You're only validating that whack job." Whenever I said I'm debating you, I got a lot of people saying don't do it, but it was more like out of sympathy for me. They're like, I mean, they would say the funniest things. My wife was even like hearing me read this off, and you made my wife laugh at me. Thanks a lot for that, Blake. But she laughed her butt off because she's like, oh my God, who is this guy? Because she doesn't follow the debate circuit as much as you and I might. But I'm reading stuff and it's saying stuff like, hey, you can't win them all, and I'm like, I haven't even talked to him yet. Give me a break. And they're like, this guy's good. Be careful. I mean, even guys that you have debated yourself, Justin Schieber, I believe. Didn't you talk to him one time too, right?
Yeah, that's right.
he was nice and polite, but he was pretty much like, all right, well, maybe you'll learn a thing or two. And I'm like, shut up, Justin. So I say all that to say, maybe we shouldn't debate as much as maybe we should just have a convo. If that's cool, maybe get to know you a little bit.
Yeah,
It's a little intimidating whenever my fellow atheists are warning me about this guy. It reminds me of that movie Kingdom of Heaven. Remember that guy who says something, paraphrase, something like your qualities will be known among your enemies before you ever meet them.
I like that.
I know atheists aren't really like your enemies per se, but just, that kind of theme was the vibe I got. So I say all that huge long intro, but I just wanted to be thorough. Really happy to have you, man. How's the day going?
Oh man, thanks for having me. Day's going great. It's 11 o'clock here in the morning, and just waking up, having my coffee, and enjoying a good conversation.
Awesome. What's Belief Map all about? I really wanted to ask you about that.
I've been interested in these conversations for a long time because even though I was raised in a Christian home, I never really thought that Christianity was true in the same sense that I thought stuff was true that I learned in school. I sort of demarcated the two. I had truth on the one hand and then my personal religion and decoration on reality on the other hand.
Oh,
and it wasn't until that's a lot of Christians, a ton of them, especially, in modern times. And it wasn't until I came across an actual case for like really believing this stuff is true that I was like, holy, it really hit me, and I really took my faith seriously. And I dove, into research on the internet. I ate it up, had a ton to learn, was wrong all the time. But in the process, I got interested in like helping people work through some of the same questions that I was working through, and having those dialogues, because they're interesting in their own sake, but it's also like, hey, there are real people behind this, and there's, we can actually help each other in talking through these issues. Anyways, long story short, I found that I would need to have my citations and evidence ready, and it transferred from an unmanageably large Word document to a new kind of note system called an outliner. Writers use it. And if you've seen Belief Map, it's basically a program version of what Belief Map is. And it ended up being so useful for me in my discussions with people to always have good important quotes and citations ready, and having the conversation mapped out, that I was like, man, if I could just put this in the hands of everyone, just imagine how much better these conversations could be with people. They could get their answers much more quickly. And I've, spent the next 7 years or so trying to make that a reality. So that's what Belief Map is. It's like you said in the intro, it's a site that can be navigated in a way that feels like having a conversation. So it's not like reading an article.
Cool. Was there one topic that you would say this one was the hardest one to cover, or were they all kind of in the same field of complexity?
Well, for the map that I was working on, I knew that the case for Jesus' resurrection, because it uses more of an inductive type approach rather than a simple deductive, I anticipated the resurrection as being the most difficult conversation to map. And I thought, you know what, if I can map this conversation, if the system works for the resurrection, then it'll work for everything else. And so I spent a long time. I think I worked through like 25, I'd have to go up to the Dallas Theological Seminary library. And as a little kid, I'm checking out all these books on the resurrection. I think I worked through about 25 books from this library on the resurrection, mapping it all into Belief Map. And that was probably the hardest.
Sounds like a lot of work. You mentioned deduction, induction. I've seen in a lot of your defenses for, I'll just say theism generally, I'm sure it was more specific than that, and you can help me out there, but you used abduction, which, always kind of seems like the red-haired stepchild of the three, you know what I mean? And and I wonder, could you just kind of run through that for us real quick? I think if it helps you remember, it was possibly in reference to probability theory, which is something you might have to teach me a little bit about. But just to give you, the reason I'm asking is because I always wondered, if abduction was an appropriate way to get these answers. So feel free to, help me out with that.
You mentioned Justin Schieber earlier. I'm with him in how I think of abduction. So let me run through what these three are, because not everyone agrees with Justin and I. But deductive reasoning is going to be your typical Craig-type argument based on premises. So you have, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. And it turns out that you can map these premises in an almost mathematical form. You can use little letters and little symbols to state the proposition, to simplify the proposition. And then there's a whole logic, again, a mathematical type of logic that can tell you whether the conclusion at least follows from the premises. Now, that doesn't mean that the premises are true. You could have false premises, but the math will tell you straightforwardly whether the conclusion follows from the premises. So that's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is more of the type of reasoning that you're going to find in court cases. It's the kind of reasoning that historians do more, where it's an evidential type of reasoning that basically wants to say, here's a piece of data. This data is more expected on one hypothesis than a competing hypothesis, and consequently, it's evidence for that hypothesis. But it's nothing like a proof. The conclusion can always be false, especially if you have competing evidence that's even greater. You should believe the competing hypothesis. I'm with Justin and many others in thinking that abductive reasoning is just a shortcut way of doing inductive reasoning. So the abductive reasoner is going to do this. He's going to say, okay, here's these competing hypotheses. Here's our pool of hypotheses. And I'm going to assess them according to some simplified tests. How plausible is the hypothesis? That's question one. What's its explanatory power? What's its explanatory scope? How ad hoc is it? So you run through this series of questions. There are different lists, but they're going to be like five questions. And basically how the hypothesis fares in relation to those questions will tell you how good it's doing abductively. So you reach a conclusion abductively when you're inferring to the best explanation based on those criteria.
Wouldn't you characterize abduction as saying that you kind of have to accept the premise at first and then you try to find the best explanation for it?
Again, it depends on who you're having a conversation with, but typically the way it works is you and your interlocutor are looking at something you agree upon. So, let's say you and I are looking at biological life on Earth, and let's say we disagree. Let's say, I think, evolution's just absurd, which I don't, by the way. But let's say I do that, and you say, no, evolution, that's legit. That's how things happened. And then we want to find out who's right. Well, what we're going to do at that point is we have an agreed upon piece of data that we're looking at, namely that there's this biological life here. We can even agree that it gives the superficial appearance of design for the most part. Then the question is who has the best explanation for that data. So you're right that there is a common thing that you agree upon. But if you don't agree upon, you can't even start the process. So you find something you agree upon, and then you ask who has the best explanation for it.
Like if we were going to use kind of these analogies to understand, tell me if I'm characterizing this in a way you'd agree. Deduction, you already laid out William Lane Craig, and I guess we could argue about soundness and validity on that, but that was a good example of deduction, sure. Induction might be, the example I'm using, William Lane Craig, he's then saying there's a God because of, deduction. And then induction might be, look around you, doesn't this all look kind of like it was designed by some kind of creator, therefore there's a God. Abduction, as I would understand it, would be more like, if we're going to say there's a God, then let's look around at this. Does this all kind of confirm our original premise?
No, that's not at all what abduction is. And even the induction one isn't quite right, because you don't want to base it on a mere appearance. What you want to say is, here's some data. This data fits better. It's more probable. It's more expected on one hypothesis than another. But the abduction thing is nowhere close. Rather, you would reach the conclusion of God abductively by holding the hypothesis of God's existence in your head, and then at the same time the hypothesis of God's non-existence in your head. And then you want to apply these set of tests to the hypotheses. Which of those two has better explanatory power? Which one has better explanatory scope? Which one is most plausible? That's where most atheists are going to come in and say, no, the God hypothesis is so implausible that even if it had some explanatory power, it doesn't live up to, it doesn't overwhelm its initial implausibility.
Wait. That doesn't sound as how I understand it. It almost sounds like that might be trying to tackle two horns at the same time. I mean, at one, maybe I misunderstood, but you're saying on one end, you're saying you hold in your head, I think is how you characterize it, that God does exist, and then on the other one that God doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. As competing hypotheses. So abductive reasoning is also called inference to the best explanation.
But how could one provide evidence that God doesn't exist? I mean, even with different debates that I might have had in the past, I never thought to even try to argue a negative in that sense. Like, that would be impossible, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't know. Can I ask you some questions and get into your thought?
Please do.
So, are you? It sounds then like you're not an atheist in the traditional sense of believing that God doesn't exist. It sounds like you're more what sometimes among the new atheist community will get called like an agnostic atheist. You're someone. Yeah. You find yourself not. You lack belief, is what you'd say.
Right. I mean, that would also be two different horns. I mean, Gnosticism in terms of knowledge. So, I mean, can I claim knowledge that God doesn't exist? I cannot find, as much as I want to, don't get me wrong, like, and I'm not trying to say that I have a bias to, I'm just saying, based on the lack of evidence, I kind of want to say that, but I can't be intellectually honest and say, I know for sure there is no God. Mm-hmm. In the same sense that I can't really say I know for sure that there are no unicorns. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to withhold belief, and that's the other horn would be belief, and that's where the atheism, theism, or atheism, no theism would come in. So, and you're totally dead spot on there. I would introduce myself as an atheist to the layman, perhaps, but to someone, you know, your caliber, agnostic atheist. But I think you and I would both admit that we're kind of tackling 2 points whenever I say that. I'm not agnostic about my atheism, and I'm not atheistic about my agnosticism. It's just the difference between knowledge and belief.
Okay, so here's my question. Consider the proposition that God exists. For me, I think the likelihood of God's existence is very high. So if you asked me, you know, assign a probability to that, I would assign, you know, maybe a 0.99. So that's like saying I'm 99% sure that God exists. So that's where I am on the spectrum. If you were like pretty darn confident that no God existed, you might assign, you know, like a 0.01 to the likelihood of God's existence. That, you know, you're 99% sure God doesn't exist. And now my question is, where on the spectrum would you be? Would you be smack dab in the middle? Or would you say maybe that God, you know, I think that there's a 0.25%?
No, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because you are like the Anthony Magnabosco of Christians. I don't know if you're familiar with him, the Street Epistemology. And
yeah, actually, he just messaged me yesterday.
Awesome. You're like, let me get your percentage now. We're going to talk for a half hour, and then I'm going to get your percentage once again. And if you claim the same percentage, you know,
I didn't know he did that. That's really cool.
Yeah, he does. He does. Yeah, I totally mischaracterized what he does. But anyway, it's just funny that I recognize very similar themes there. But I have a problem with your question right from the start. And maybe my problem is that I didn't let you finish it. But
no, that was it.
Okay, good. And that is you're once again, you're trying to tackle two horns of the dilemma. I agree that we would say there are only two possibilities. This is a true dichotomy, not a false dichotomy, not a logical fallacy here, but we're saying God either does or does not exist. Very simple. I'm with you 100%. But whenever you start saying, well, let's look at probability or what percentage of confidence or belief you have in both of these simultaneously, I feel like using that method can maybe not necessarily going to lead to a problem, but it's very dangerous. And I don't know that I like the idea of trying to tackle two horns of a dilemma simultaneously, because lots of times that, I think you would admit, that leads us into problems. So I get that out just to go right back to say, God does or does not exist. It starts from the null set, right? It starts from who is making the claim. And as an agnostic, I'm not making the claim that there is no God. I accept that I cannot logically prove that argument, so I simply don't. That's intellectually honest as far as I know it to be. But whenever someone claims to be a Gnostic theist, for instance, which I think would be fair to characterize you as, correct me if I'm wrong, you're claiming knowledge of God and a belief in God. So the burden of proof would be on your end. So to try to tackle both horns and say, well, how much do you feel about this and how much do I feel about this? That we could do that, and that's fine. We could go down that road, but I feel like it's almost like as if we're using different definitions for the same word, and we keep using the same word and talking past each other. Not that that's what it is, but that it would be synonymous with doing something like that, because we could go through the whole thing and then get to the end conclusion and go, yeah, but I never really said there was no God anyway. Mm-hmm. I don't know that would be a proper way for us to solve this problem. And that was my initial issue with abduction from the beginning, which I understand you're saying, well, Robert, you misunderstand how I'm using abduction. I don't know that I can follow you there.
We can talk about burdens of proof, because I think it's a bit more complex. I incidentally think that depending on the claim, for example, does I
oversimplified it, didn't I?
Yeah, I think. Okay. I don't know if this is worth sitting down and explaining. Let me just say, trust me. Trust me here.
Sure.
so that I can understand where you're at. I'm not going to say that you're making a claim or that this has anything to do with burdens of proof. I'm just going to ask, consider one proposition, the proposition that God exists. You're going to be on this is just one proposition, God exists, somewhere on the spectrum.
So we're just skipping over my objection and just going right to it anyway.
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
You're somewhere on the spectrum. If you think that if you're like right in the middle, you are completely unsure whether God exists or not, you'd be 0.5. If you're pretty darn sure that God exists, you might be 0.8, 0.9. Where are you actually?
I don't want to use the term play along, but I can't think of a better way to say it because, once again, I really object to this kind of logic. But let's see here. If I had to say, like, how confident am I that God exists? Well, it can't be, like, zero confidence. If I was, let's say I die and I go to heaven or hell or something like that, my confidence certainly could be increased. So we can't be working from a factor of zero.
Right.
Because zero confidence... help me out here with your probability theorem, but zero confidence would mean that nothing's going to change that, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So obviously it could be changed. I don't know. Throw out a number. Throw a dog a bone here. Help me out. I don't know what amount of belief I have in God. You're asking an atheist what percentage of belief do you have in God? That's a weird question.
It's more like what's the probability of God's existence? What do you think the probability is? Like
you could do? You could help me out with this because obviously I'm not following. Let's reverse it for a second. And this isn't to make a point. This is just to kind of get a feel for what you're expecting from me here. Let's reverse it just to play the game here. If we're talking atheism, what probability percentage would you put toward there is no God as a Christian?
Well, if you're talking about we're not talking about the probability that God exists anymore. We're talking about the probability that God doesn't exist. Since you're right about the dichotomy point, this is a true dichotomy. It would just be the reverse of the proposition that God exists. So if I think the likelihood of God's existence is 0.99, that would entail that the likelihood of God's non-existence is 0.1. So I would answer 0.1.
Okay, cool. All right, then, and like I was saying, that wasn't like a let me switch it up on you kind of thing. That was just to help me understand. All right, I'm 0.1.
Sure. Okay, so
proceed, sir.
Or I meant 0.01. So that's 1%.
Oh, good point.
So right. you think there's like a maybe a 1% likelihood that God exists.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take 1%.
Okay. So you would definitely like under any definition, you'd certainly be an atheist. Myself, I understand an agnostic to be someone who is at the 0.5 area. They withhold belief because they're not inclined one way or the other to believe. You actually do have a fairly strong belief in God's non-existence. Now, hold on, real quick.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying you're claiming anything in a conversation, but in terms of a belief, you do have a strong belief. Not certainty, but a belief that God doesn't exist. But you're not claiming it. I understand that.
You're asking if I have a belief that God doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Those words do not make sense to me. And I'm not trying to be stubborn or anything here. I'm really trying to be open with you. And a belief that God doesn't exist
you think it's more likely than
that's
not.
a mischaracterization of how belief works. In the same sense of whenever you described an agnostic as being 50% belief, there is no way that I'm just going to say it, there's no way that you can use agnosticism in that way, because agnosticism has nothing to do with belief. And the same sense as whenever you say, as an atheist, I have a belief that there is no God, I don't know, that would be a different term altogether. And I don't want to get buried in semantics, and maybe that's kind of my fault. Maybe I'm pushing it that way, but it's hard for me to follow with you. I have to start omitting certain very basic premises that I use to make my decisions. I have to start just saying, okay, well, we'll skip past whether or not I could put a percentage on something I don't even believe in. Okay, we'll have to skip past my understanding of abduction to give respect to you. We could say we disagree, or we could just say maybe I don't understand it as thoroughly as you do. Okay, I would have to also omit the very premise of my understanding of myself as an agnostic atheist to keep going. It's fine. We'll keep going and let's see where it gets us. And that could be a lot of fun. But I really want to just make it clear, like, at each step of the way, you're demanding a lot, Blake.
Here's the thing: is we don't even have to use the words agnostic or atheist, or we can define them however you like. I can tell you how it's defined in academia and in peer-reviewed literature, but at the end of the day, let's just have a conversation and we can define ourselves just fine. But in order for me to understand where you're at, because necessarily you are somewhere on that spectrum, the fact that you think the likelihood of God's existence is about 1%, or somewhere in that vicinity, that's all I need to know. And now I can start asking the question, okay, so why are you at 1% rather than 50%? It seems to me, maybe at a first glance, for a given proposition, if you have no evidence for or against it, you might be inclined more towards the middle. I mean, is there a particle? Does a particle exist that is smaller than our smallest known particle? So you say a quark is our smallest known particle.
Oh, that's a fun one. I see what you're doing there. Like, I can't say that I know there isn't, but I don't believe in a smaller particle than what is known. But your argument would be, and help me understand here, your argument would be, in that same sense, I'm also making the belief claim?
No, here, let's ask the same question about a particle. So, as far as I know, I'm pretty confident a quark is our smallest known particle. But there's still a further question. Is there an unknown particle, does it exist, that is smaller than the quark? I myself am, I don't have really evidence for or against that. And so my current position on that, I would say my belief, my confidence, what's the term I wanted to use? Credence value, as Boghossian likes to put it, which is the right term, is about 0.5 in the proposition that there's a particle that's smaller than our smallest known particle. And now I'm asking, where are you on that?
Okay, on that one, I would probably be a lot higher of a percentage than that, simply because as much as I understand quantum physics, it seems to be this constantly reducing amount of complexity. Things just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I would try to use other things, like I've seen you use for, not to change the topic, but just as a comparison, for historicity of Christ and that sort of thing, where we might say that there's other factors that we could add into this to help us understand in history. So I look at the history of science and say, yeah, we used to think that there was nothing smaller than a speck of dirt, maybe, and then we found, oh, well, there's something as small as an atom, but nothing smaller than that.
Okay,
and then, yeah.
Let me stop you. If you think that you have evidence for there being something smaller, then I'm just going to drop that particular example. I wanted to pick something that I thought you'd agree we'd have no evidence for or against it.
Well, I'm agreeing that there's no solid evidence, right? There's no empirical data for it. I'm just saying from, yeah, and I'm not
a reason. You have a reason for thinking there's going to be something smaller. If we had a lot more time, I'd say I actually think that that's an improper inductive inference, but it would just take too long. So
now you got me confused. So wouldn't you say that your reasons for believing in God, if we're going to go away from that analogy and go back to the original premise, don't you have reasons for that?
Yeah. But what I wanted to get at is, it seems to me that if you don't have any particular evidence against God, at least at a first pass, that would sooner imply agnosticism, that you should be around. Drop that term. We're not using those terms. If you have no reason for or against the existence of God, my question would be, why are you at 0.1?
Oh, okay.
Instead of in the middle.
So if I was to compare this to what I referenced earlier with the unicorn, for example, and I said, well, I don't believe in a unicorn, but I don't have knowledge of a lack of unicorn. But you were to say, well, why don't you believe in unicorn? Let's say we weren't like talking about all this kind of deep deductive and inductive reasoning kind of stuff. You know, my daughter just comes up to me, a little sweetheart, and says, Daddy, are there unicorns? And I'm going to be like, no, sweetheart, there aren't unicorns. She's like, well, why don't you believe in unicorns? I believe in unicorns. And my first answer right off the bat would be something like, well, have you ever seen a unicorn? So I guess in that sense, like if we're going to go that route, then I would say, well, I've never seen a God. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. That's your reason. Yeah. And so this is, when I said earlier that the, what's called the prior probability, the initial point prior to seeing evidence for or against a proposition, that can actually change. In the case of a particle, I would think that you would start at about 0.5. In the case of, do minds exist other than your own?
Yeah, on the particle, I'd be more like 0.8 or 9, but okay. That's just me, I guess.
Yeah. And that there's a big, philosophical argument that, is really notoriously difficult to answer. All the popular answers have counter responses that can't be responded to easily, at least, which is that, it's actually ridiculously hard to confirm that there are minds other than your own. Nevertheless, we have this initial, it seems incredibly implausible to us that our mind is the only one. Solipsism is the view that only our mind exists, and in fact, all alleged matter in the world doesn't exist either. This is all just a figment of our imagination, of our dream, and there's nothing to wake up from.
Oh, cool. So because of the problem with the particle analogy, we're using the solipsism analogy. Is that how I should understand it?
I'll get to it very quickly this way. If I ask you what's the likelihood that an external world exists, that this isn't just your dream world, you would say, well, the likelihood that an external world exists outside my mind is really high. You can't have evidence for that.
Well, what do you mean by world? Like universe?
Reality. No. All
you mean
that
supernatural?
Exist. The set of all things that exist is your world.
I can't prove there's not a supernatural, so in that same sense, all things that exist, I can only claim all things that exist that I am aware of.
But no, you're real quick. Let me back up again. Solipsism is the view that only your mind exists, and everything you see around you, everything that you are aware of, and is all that exists.
Yeah, brain in a vat kind of thing.
Yeah, except there's no brain and there's no
not
vat.
Even a vat.
Yeah, there's nothing. Solipsism is the view that it's just your mind.
Just your mind, like a bodiless mind.
Right, and here's my ultimate point, is that you can't have, notoriously, this is a philosophical, notoriously issue, is that you can't get evidence that this proposition is false, because anything that you see in your world could just be part of the dream.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you would say that the likelihood of an external world existing outside your mind is much higher than 0.5. So,
wait. I don't, man, you lost me again. You're talking about hard solipsism. And then you say, well, what is the likelihood that there's something beyond this? But how could you even apply likelihood to that scenario of solipsism itself? That just wouldn't be an avenue that you would have available to you.
Well, why not? You ask yourself right now, what's the likelihood that something exists outside of your external mind? Or excuse me, that it's something that exists external to your mind. What's the likelihood that there's an external world out there?
Well, without
the only evidence you have is what's coming in from your experience.
Right, but without the assumption of solipsism, the likelihood is extremely high. With the assumption of solipsism, I would say the assumption would be pretty low, because every single thing that I could even imagine would also be a product of this kind of deterministic thing that's going on inside my mind that's causing me to imagine it, and that's also being manifested by me. So that's my problem, is once you start off, and that I kind of feel like this goes right back to my initial conflict with your use of abduction, because once you start off saying, well, here we have solipsism, what else is there? I'd say, well, with solipsism, nothing else is there. By definition, that would be a priori knowledge that there is no other thing other than what's in my head. There is no probability. But if you're asking probability of what's beyond my mind without the crazy Seitan Bruggencate style solipsism stuff, right, then I would be like, well, that's probably highly likely, because I assume that there are other individuals, and I use myself as an individual to understand other individuals. So whenever I see someone else, Robert has a body, Blake has a body, my individuality exists within my body, whether you're like me and you believe the light goes out when you die, or if you're a dualist, like maybe some kind of Christian teaching. But either way, we could say this other person has a body, so I would assume that's another mind outside of my mind. But I can't do that with solipsism whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Am I misunderstanding you?
My ultimate point, again, I don't want to bore anybody who might be listening, but my ultimate point
our listeners are complete nerds.
Okay.
So.
The ultimate point is that evidence isn't going to give you the whole picture of where you're going to ultimately be on that spectrum we've been talking about. When it comes to something like the, like an invisible unicorn in, somewhere in the universe, there are reasons for why that would have a very low prior probability, and that's why you'd have to have. That's why I wouldn't be agnostic about it. I would assign a 0.0001 to or even lower to something like that prior to seeing any evidence for or against it. When it comes to the particle,
oh my God, dude! I think I just figured out what you're saying, but I'll let you finish, and then I'll try to say it back to you, and you tell me if I got it. But I think I just got what you're saying. Go ahead.
Okay, good. So when it comes to some hypotheses, it's going to take into account things like their complexity, the number of assumptions that get involved in it. It's going to have a very low prior probability. This would be the category, certainly, that this, an invisible unicorn somewhere in the universe would get. Other propositions like, is there a particle that's smaller than the smallest known particle? Prior to seeing any evidence for or against, I'm going to be hovering around the 0.5 point area. And then finally, there are some propositions like an external world exists outside of your mind. I think by definition, you can't have any evidence for or against this hypothesis. And nevertheless, for this final existence claim, I think it has a very high prior probability. And so here you have 3 different existence claims, 3 completely different prior probabilities. And then, that goes ultimately back to your question is, okay, what about the invisible pink unicorn? Or the invisible unicorn? I was trying to answer that. And the question final question, is God more like the invisible unicorn? Is God more like the particle? Or is God more like an external world? Which of those what's the natural good starting place to hold your credence value?
I love how you use 3 different examples and tied them together. Very well done. And the moment of enlightenment that I got of seeing where you're coming from is you're basing belief on the scale of agnosticism in the middle, atheism on one end, theism on the other end, or let's not even use atheism, theism. We'll just say belief and complete non-belief, not sure in the middle. And I would say that scale is complete nonsense. But that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying your theory is nonsense. Actually, I love how you constructed it. I'm very impressed. But I'm just saying that scale that you're using, that's just not how it works as I understand it. However, to kind of jump ahead and say, okay, here is yet another hurdle that you're forcing me to jump over against my will, but I really am enjoying this, so let's keep doing it, I feel like you handed me a pill and said, don't worry about what it is, you're going to like it. I'm like, I trust you, Blake, let me pop this pill. I'm sure that's never happened to you. It's happened to me a couple times, and you wake up next to someone that you wish you didn't. But anyway, so here's what happens. It was Bill Cosby. So if I'm going to say God, my belief in God, which one is it closest to of these 3? You said pink unicorn, didn't you?
Yeah.
You kind of added to it.
The original idea is the invisible pink unicorn, but invisible and pink are a contradiction, so I just leave that out. Right now we're just dealing with the invisible unicorn.
Well, how can you tell it's not pink? It's invisible, Blake. No, I'm just kidding. All right, invisible pink unicorn, just pink unicorn. Quark being the smallest particle, and the third one was hard solipsism, right?
Yeah, the existence of an external world.
And what was our, just to help me out, what was our level of percentage on each of the 3?
I mean, for the likelihood of an invisible unicorn existing, for me at least, I mean, it might be different for you, but for me, I find myself assigning like a 0.000001 likelihood to such a thing existing. For the particle smaller than a quark, I'm at a 0.5. And for the external world, I'm at a 0.9999999. Very confident that it exists. And I say this, and I have no evidence for or against any of them.
And the third one with solipsism isn't with the assumption of solipsism. It's actually just saying whether or not you think there are other minds in this current reality.
Yeah, do I think that there's an external world?
Okay.
And I think that the likelihood of an external world existing outside my mind, even though I have no evidence for or against, is 0.9999999. Very high.
And which one would God be closest to? Boy, I feel like you're asking me like if there's an electric train going through the tunnel, where does the smoke come out? you know, or like a one-story house and everything's blue, what color are the stairs? You know, it's almost, I don't want to characterize it as a trick question, but it's like, I don't know where God would fall. I guess just because the analogy of the unicorn, but seems to be the one that applies to God the best. I guess I could go unicorn route. Sure.
Yeah, I think, that wasn't necessarily me trying to learn about you. I already knew that was your position. The question is that the right way to think about it? So before
Blake, you knew the answer before you asked the question. That is sneaky. Anyway, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
But when we're asking ourselves, you and I, as seekers of truth, does God exist? That first question, I think, should be, what is the prior probability of God's existence? I incidentally would make the case that God is closer to 0.5 starting out, and then people can accumulate evidence for or against the God hypothesis and get there as a result. I can tell you why I think God is around 0.5 or even higher.
Are you saying that we should start at 0.5?
Yeah. Sooner.
Whoa.
Real quick, but I'm not gonna get into that now, because that would. If you've seen my very first debate with Matt Dillahunty, I got into it, but it's that's at if you want to find it on YouTube, it's our Bible and Beer Consortium debate. Does God exist? The first debate, number one, because we had two on that with the BBC. And
to back that up, that was an awesome debate. And what's really cool about it, guys, is right at the end, they both just sit down and chat. And then I want to say, either after that debate or after your next debate, you guys actually just sat down on a couch for a while and chatted about some crazy stuff like, how do we know there's anything outside the room, and how do we know if aliens exist? Like, it's really, anyway, anybody that isn't familiar with those, I totally agree with Blake. You got to check them out. They're fun to watch.
Yeah, but it would take forever for us to get into how do we get the right prior probability for God. What we can talk about very briefly and get some ideas out on the table with the time that we have left, and I'm not in any rush, so you can hold me here as long as you want, is we can talk about the second part of the equation. Is what's the evidence for and against God?
Wait. You're saying we'll talk about the second part, but the first part would take too much time to get into.
Yeah, because the first part.
But you're making me jump again, and I understand what you're saying. Like, dude, that is a long talk. But this seems to be a theme here. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. But at each step of the way, I'm going, I'm sorry, I really can't accept this basic premise. And you go, yeah, but if you accept it, let's move on. And now we're like going to step 2. And I'm like, I don't even accept step 1. I don't think we should start at 0.5.
My hope was that you would agree that the particle, that without any evidence for and against God, that you would sooner be at 0.5. If you don't accept that, then we'll just move on. And I'll try to see, because again, I'm trying to pick what in sales is called the path of least resistance. I want to persuade you, and I've got a time limit. If you grant me these couple premises here, then I can use those to persuade you. But you just told me you don't grant that particular premise, and now I have to make a decision. Okay, do I sit here spending the time trying to convince you of this premise, or do I just try to move on to something else that I can get done more quickly?
Fair enough. Yeah, I want your time to be used as valuably as you can. I am very much enjoying this, so please proceed, sir.
Okay, so you're assigning a prior probability to God around 1%, and so even though there's no necessarily evidence for or against God's existence, that's where you lie. And now the question is, okay, let's pull in some evidence and see if we can bump you up from 1% confidence in God's existence. Let's see if we can get that higher, and how much higher. So let's pick an argument for God's existence.
Okay.
And actually, I shouldn't make an assumption. Do you maybe your initial, the prior probability for God was like 0.30 for you, 30%, and then you have like the evidence from evil for God's non-existence, and that brought you down to 1%. So before I make any assumptions, do you have particular reasons that you dropped down to number 1? Is there evidence against God that you found particularly good that dropped you down?
I don't want to be a pain in the butt here, but let me characterize it as the way that I believe my belief structure began and ended. So right from the beginning, straight up hardcore fundamentalist style childhood indoctrination. You're going to hell if you're bad. You go to heaven if you're good. As I started understanding these concepts a little more, it was all like, Jesus is a really nice guy, and somehow he's white. I don't know. He's Middle Eastern white guy. He's somebody that you love. Color Jesus. Don't go outside the lines. You might go to hell. And then, like, as Sunday school developed, coloring books started becoming more like memorizing Bible passages that I didn't understand. Then later on, conveniently, like, I'm sitting in service because I'm no longer in the kids thing where I'm singing kids songs. Father Abraham had many sons. You know, remember that one? And then now I'm in church, and all these Bible verses are being repeated back to me, and I can actually, like, mouth the words as they're saying them and that sort of thing, and flipping through my Bible, like, super fast. So I'm getting some confidence in this. The people I'm looking around and seeing are like, you know, oh, these guys around me also believe this thing I believe, so that kind of confirms my belief structure. Then there's, like, the morality system of this, where I jerk off and I feel dirty, you know, but now I'm, like, right around 12, 13 or something, and if I feel bad about it, then that confirms the belief that it must be bad, and that this is all making perfect sense. There's a little bit of body shaming involved. Also, there's the idea of I'm a man comparing me to a woman. A woman needs to have certain rules, and women that don't have these rules, look how bad they are. Therefore, that confirms. And there's just all this kind of like confirmation upon this very basic structure of fear, the fear of the Lord, right? So as this kept going, then one day I'm reading Job, and God's being a total dick. And I'm like, wow, why is he being mean to Job? Like, of all the people he could sick on Job, he could have sick a werewolf on him, he could have sicked a vampire, he could have sicked, you know, Dennis Rodman for all I care, who's a horrible person. I'm just kidding. Anyway, but it doesn't matter who but he decides to sick Satan on the guy, like, hey, Satan, I dare you to screw up Job's life. And Job's life gets totally screwed up, and then he shows up as a tornado, and he's like, what, you got a problem with me? I'm God, you know, and it's like, oh, this doesn't add up from what I've been told. So it wasn't so much that I got a new idea about God as something that would make me say, well, God can exist because he has immoral contradictions to the Bible or what have you. Not trying to get into biblical contradictions per se, but I'm just using that as an example. But it's not so much that I got stuff that made me think there is no God. It's that things that had been put there already started getting challenged. Mm-hmm. And one by one, it's almost like if there's this mountain of marbles that my parents and the Bible itself and all the people around me and the system of capitalism in America. I mean, there's so many different factors, marketing, and just everything around us is kind of very manipulated through culture, and culture kind of derives from a religion. And just there's this huge mountain of marbles that developed, and I just started picking one marble away at a time. And it didn't really seem like a big deal. It wasn't that much of a threat. And I think this is why doubt can be so threatening to Christianity, is because it starts off so subtle. And I'm like, all right, we got Job and some morality issues here. And then I'm looking at the flood, and I'm like, God drowned babies too? That's weird. And then, you know, I'm looking at another part where he tells the Israelites to go and kill everybody and, you know, cut open pregnant women's stomachs, you know, like, Jesus Christ. So at each point of the way, I'm just pulling these marbles off. So I say all that, and I'm sorry for the long explanation, but you asked and I had to answer as honestly as I could. When you say you've had some stuff that might make you believe and you got some stuff that might make you not believe, that once again is a mischaracterization of how I understand my own beliefs to work on a very, I'm not just saying this like a defensive, like logical debate thing. Like, I'm being very personal with you, Blake. Mm-hmm. That's just not how I work. Maybe that's how I'm supposed to work. Maybe that's how other people work. I don't think that's how the listener works either. And I think that you are given these ideas, and then maybe they start crumbling and deteriorating and falling apart over time. Is that fair?
For what it's worth, you know, this is a very standard way of assessing the likelihoods of propositions, because at the end of the day, it's not just believe or disbelieve. It's you think that there's a certain likelihood that a proposition is true. And so Justin Schieber would be going with me here. It would be very common, by far the default position among atheists and atheist defenders who work in the philosophy of religion, which is the weird title assigned to the philosophy of debating God's existence.
Well, now I feel super lonely, because not only am I opposed to theists, but I'm apparently opposed to atheists too.
Well, honestly, a lot of theists aren't even aware of it. Most of them aren't at all. But generally, if you're wanting to assess whether a given proposition is true, is John the murderer? Does God exist? You know, is the Big Bang true? You're holding the proposition up, and you have two questions. Is first, what's the prior probability? And two, then what's the evidence for and against? And when you put that together, you have at the end of the equation, you have a final probability, a likelihood of the Big Bang being true or God existing, or these that John is the murderer. So I at first I thought that I could quickly get you to say, okay, I guess if there's no evidence for or against, the likelihood of God would be 0.5. That didn't work, so I'm just moving past it.
But you've heard Dawkins say like atheists are like trying to herd cats. So I'm sorry. It's not that I've deliberately tried to be uncooperative. I've just really been trying to just tell you personally how I feel about these things you're saying.
Yeah, you've done nothing wrong at all. Nothing wrong at all. I just haven't been persuasive quickly enough. But now I'm saying, okay, let's forget about the first part of the equation. I'm going to focus on the second part, the evidence for and against. Go ahead, have a low prior probability of God. I'm going to see if I can knock it up even higher to get you past maybe even 0.5. But before I do that, I need to know, should I address anything that's any evidence that's knocking the probability lower? If you wanted to cite, anything in the Old Testament, as I think my general strategy, I'm just going to say, okay, that's irrelevant to whether God exists. I'm just you don't even for Christianity, it's not really too relevant because you can just say, okay, fine, the Bible has errors. It's unreliable.
Yeah, like where you said, Isaiah said, I am God, I create good, I create evil, I the Lord do all these things. I could, if I were to say, I'm trying to play along here and just make sure I'm following you. If I were to say, look, God's evil, therefore I shouldn't believe in him, that would be the example, one that you might be using?
Well, okay, so the part of me is tempted to respond to these various things that you're saying, but I'm working really hard so I can stay on topic, and you're right. In that case, I would just say, yeah, why believe the Bible? God can exist and the Bible can be bunk. The Bible
Perfect.
Can be whatever. So
I see your
Bible,
point, yeah.
Whatever's going on in the Bible, that's irrelevant to the proposition that God exists, as far as I can tell. So these things that you mentioned shouldn't be evidence against God. Instead, as you might have intimated, is maybe before you considered these things as evidence for God, and now the evidence that you had got knocked down.
Oh, excellent. Okay, I'm with you.
And that's fine. The question is, should you be knocked all the way down to, if we were going to that first part of the equation, I'd be like, that knocks you all the way down to 1% likelihood of God's existence. I would say no. But that's a different, again, that's the different discussion for another time. My question right now is, do you have any evidence against God's existence aside from the initial prior probability that you assign to God? Is there anything like the problem of evil, or that is to say the problem of suffering, or the problem of divine hiddenness, or internal contradictions in the concept of God? These types of things would take you from whatever your initial probability was, maybe 0.30, maybe a 30%, and those kinds of things. After you think about them, after you think about the evidence against God, it could knock you down to 0.01 likelihood that God exists.
Totally. But I mean, help me out. Even something like an example like you use, like problem of evil, I think this could apply to all your examples. The only power that they have in causing doubt is because they contradict an already assumed feature of God, right? So if you say, right off the bat, if you said, well, do you believe in God or not? And I said, well, can you make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? You say, well, why would I even bring that up unless I'm referring to the previous claim of his omniscience? So it's almost like with each reason for my lack of faith, or my, as you might characterize it, my percentage of unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of one that I could present except for those that are arguing against the premise. At anything that I can say against the existence of God, the only value to what I'm saying is because we're already assuming this to be a feature of this thing that we're referring to as divine.
Okay, so real quick, this is my fault. I should have defined God at the beginning so that we're working with the same understanding. We're holding the same proposition as we evaluate it. In Western philosophy, God is supposed to be the greatest possible being, maximally worthy of worship. And so theism is the view that such an entity actually exists. And in virtue of God's being maximally great, then God is plausibly understood to be the singular, all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, everlasting, or eternal, perfectly free creator of the universe. That's the Western philosophy understanding of God. That's what we're holding up and thinking about. And so tucked into that definition, in order for God to be maximally great, is for God to be all good. And so that's why I believe, and that's why in philosophy of religion, when you have guys like Michael Tooley and Quentin Smith and Graham Oppie, all these guys arguing against God, they don't spend time arguing that if God exists, God would be all good, and then go on to present the problem of evil. It's just recognized that if God exists, God's supposed to be all good in virtue of his being the greatest possible being. So they just want to make a case against God, and they go straight to the problem of evil. They say, look at the suffering in the world. This wouldn't be here if God existed. And everybody understands what they're doing. And now I'm asking you, given that understanding of God, would you say that the likelihood of God's existence has taken a significant hit because of the problem of suffering, the problem of hiddenness, or because of any internal contradictions in the idea of God? And if so, I wanted to talk about it.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, then with that one, I would totally bite at your bait of saying, how could there be evil in the world or bad in the world if he's all good? Sure.
Cool. Got it.
Fair enough.
So you're at one, a 1% likelihood that God exists. What that tells me, because you're telling me right now that evil in the world contributes to your belief, or contributes to you assigning a 1% likelihood to God's existence. What that tells me is if I knocked out the evidence from suffering, if I convinced you, this in fact isn't surprising at all on the God hypothesis, this isn't evidence at all against God's existence, then because we have taken away what caused you to drop down to 1%, it would at least bump you up a little when we reverse it. So you might have started at thinking, look, the likelihood of God's existence is maybe 30, 40%, but over time, I kind of became aware of this problem of suffering for the God hypothesis. And as a result, my likelihood got dropped down, several percentage points. And now I'm down at 1%. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, once again, this whole scale thing, but I'm with you. Like, if my problem was evil in the world, and that's why there can't be a maximally good God, then if you could explain the problem of evil, then my percentage should inevitably increase. With you 100%. Okay. Yeah.
So now let me choose, because you know yourself better than I do. I'm going to let you choose. We can either address some of those things that have knocked your probability all the way down to 1%, or we can discuss some evidence for God. And what can happen there is, hey, even if you have evidence that John is the murderer, I can give some evidence, some counter evidence that John isn't the murderer. I can either attack your evidence, or I can give you some evidence and just convince you anyways. And I'm going to let you pick. What would be probably the best approach with you in convincing you? Would it be better stewardship of our time to focus on addressing some particular objection to God? Or would it be better probably to spend some time looking at the evidence for God?
Decent. Well, logically, it would be better, since you have the burden of proof, for you to defend the evidence for God. However, it'd probably be more fun for you to kick my butt about something that I have a problem with about God. But that's kind of circular reasoning, because whatever I present as a problem with God is only going to be in response to the claim of whatever it is. So like whenever you say God is maximally good, well, I can object to that thing, but I can't produce a problem of God. I can't argue from a negative position. So they're really the exact same thing if you think about it. It would just be whether or not I start the topic or you start the topic. But even if I say a reason I don't believe, I'm really just criticizing a point of your claim about God. It's not really mine. It's just my critique of something you have.
Let me ask it again in other words, and if it doesn't work, then I'll just pick one. But let's say in thinking about the evidence against God from evil in the world, that might have only knocked you down 1%. And if that's the case, it wouldn't make sense for us to spend a lot of time on it, because it's really not doing that much damage to the belief in God's existence in the first place.
Right,
Whereas if you look around and see the suffering in the world and you're like, man, this is before I would have more naturally been at 0.5 or even 0.7, 70% chance that God exists. But now that I see the evil in the world, man, it's knocked me all the way down to 1%.
Right, Blake, I'm with you 100%. But, I mean, do you get my point that even if I said a reason for my lack of belief or unbelief is because of evil in the world, you recognize that I am simply just rejecting one of your claims about his personality that he is all good, right? Like, it's not even something I'm just pulling out of my butt. I'm simply referring to one of your descriptions.
In logic, there's something called modus tollens. If proposition 1 implies proposition number 2, and then you can either refute or make highly improbable proposition number 2, then it correspondingly refutes proposition number 1. And the relevance of that is that if you can establish that God is not all good, or that a perfectly good being doesn't exist, that would knock out the God hypothesis. It would be great evidence against God.
Let me ask just a real basic one then. How could there be a good God if bad things happen?
Excellent. And how could is like, how do you make sense of that? Surely this is big evidence against God. And I have a multiple-pronged approach, 3 in particular. I want to focus on 2 of those prongs. The second 2 would be first, that I'm going to play what's called the skeptical theism card a little bit. And then I'm going to go into theodicies, particular reasons why God very plausibly might allow for suffering. The skeptical theism card says, look, how confident can we be in looking out into the world that a perfect God might how confident can we be that God would not have quote unquote morally justifying reasons for permitting that suffering? What you can say is, here I see suffering, and I see no reason, nothing comes to my mind. I can't think of a reason for why God would allow for this. And then the question is, how strongly can you infer from that therefore there could be no reason? A perfect God could not have any such reason, a justifying reason that would persuade even you that it's justifying and permissible.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you 100%. That would kind of be an argument from ignorance to say I can't think of a better reason for why God would allow suffering, so therefore suffering and God must not be able to coexist. Right? I can see that could be a fallacy in itself, sure.
Yeah. And again, I think that it can be some evidence. What I want to do, though, is I want to blunt your confidence a little bit. I want to say, okay, you're really assuming a lot about your ability to do these calculations about what sorts of goods come out of this suffering and what types of goods ultimately may result in this suffering. It's a big, complex calculation. It can be really hard to do. So this isn't to say it's not evidence. It's just to say maybe it's not as strong of evidence as you might initially think. That's part 1.
Fair enough.
Part number 2 is I'm going to kind of try to amplify that point even stronger by maybe bringing up some considerations that hadn't even been in your awareness, depending on the types of evils that you cite. Can I give you a list of, I think it's like 11 theodicies that play a role in explaining kinds of suffering that we run into in the world?
All right, hit me.
All right. And this is all on Belief Map if you want to get into the details, because it's a huge section. But here are the titles. The titles can be a little misleading, but here are at least the titles of the kinds of reasons that God might allow suffering. I'm not even saying that any particularly one of them is the reason, but since we're making a case against God, here are the kinds of reasons that would need to be closed off in order to charge God as guilty. So here they are. So one is that free agency in a moral arena is good. So it's good for us to make free choices which result in deliberate courses of action, courses that really matter for ourselves and others, especially in the context of eternity. And this is relevant because the degree to which we are free and empowered, there's also a corresponding risk of our making effective choices which permit or bring suffering on ourselves or on others. But in a world that allows for free agency, you're going to see some suffering. That doesn't apply to the leukemia case or so forth, because those are natural evils. But that's an example of how do you explain some evil.
Right. Another one is I hit my hand with a hammer. I can't be like, God damn it, he did this to me, right? I'm with you, I guess, in some ways. I mean, there's some objections there, but I don't think your goal is for me to offer objections through 1 through 11. This is just a good time for you to present all 11. Would that be right?
Yeah, and we can come back and hit on the ones that you think are definitely worth addressing. Another thing that might require risk or result in suffering is the ability to form our own character. This is a good that can require risk or result in suffering. Again, this has a lot to do with freedom. The big section on a belief map about that. The next one is in order to get God's atonement for people like Paul in the Bible, just as an example, which I think is a great good. I have an argument, a whole article on why this is a good thing in the world. God's atonement for people like Paul. It's a loving atonement. You can't get that if these people are all perfect. If you're going to get this kind of good, you need to allow for some kind of people to do wrong things and cause suffering in the world.
Just to help me understand, number 3 is you can't have good if you don't have a little bad, right?
That's actually all 3. All of them. The grand thing I'm going to try to say is
one and two is free will.
Right, but free will is a good thing. That's the point. Is some goods require
But number
risk.
3 is more like a yin-yang. Like you can't say that the sunrise is beautiful unless you would say that the lack of sunrise is something that you miss the beauty of it. Right? Is that fair?
All of them have that element.
Okay.
So here, listen to this. What I'm going to try to say is that some goods require risk or result in suffering. If I can establish that, then you could see why God might allow for suffering, because some goods require risk or result. It's because you get greater goods out of it. And I pointed out 3 goods so far, which together could ultimately be greater than the suffering in the world. The 3 that I've covered so far is free agency in a moral arena, the ability to form our own character, and the ability for God to atone for people like Paul. These are 3 goods of the 11 that I'm going through, and they each require risk or result in suffering.
And you couldn't have atonement without being bad in the first place. Is
Right,
that fair? Okay.
Exactly. If everybody was perfect, then God coming down incarnate and lovingly atoning or making some kind of sacrifice on their behalf, couldn't exist. That would be what at least I would argue is a good in the world, a really beautiful good that couldn't exist. Just an example.
All right.
So fourth would be worldly people turning to seek God. And this one I'll probably elaborate on the most because it can be the hardest to understand. But
yeah, my whole face just squinted like I sucked a lemon right when you said that. So I'm listening.
Let me see if I can convince you. Again, the rest won't be this long. But I would argue, again, there's a whole article just on establishing that this is good. I would say seeking fellowship with God is a great good, especially in the context of eternity. And this is relevant because with less suffering, fewer people would seek God. In fact, as noted in the 2005 Wynn Gallup International poll, religiosity actually declines as worldly prosperity of individuals rises. That's one point. Studies also
yeah. Why do you think that is?
I'll tell you exactly why. But just the second point in that train of thought is that studies also confirm that Christianity grows most rapidly during hardships.
Yeah.
And thirdly, is that it's intuitively clear that suffering would lead us to turn to God. Have you heard of Eleanor Stump? She's a philosophy professor at St. Louis. I don't know if you.
No, good.
Wonderful.
Tell me about Stumpy.
Well, I just wanted to share a really cool quote from hers in an article that she published on the topic. And she says, quote, "Natural evil, the pain of disease, the intermittent and unpredictable destruction of natural disasters, the decay of old age, the imminence of death, takes away a person's satisfaction with himself. It tends to humble him, show him his frailty, make him reflect on the transience of temporal goods, and turn his affections toward otherworldly things, away from things of this world." And let me read you one more quote from Peter von Inwagen, he's one of my favorite philosophers. It's a little bit longer, but bear with me because I think it really drives home the point. He says, if God did what was proposed, in terms of eliminating a world with evil, if God did what was proposed, we should all be satisfied with our existence, or at least a lot closer to being satisfied than most of us are now. And if we're satisfied with our existence, why should we even consider turning to God and asking for his help? An essential and important component of God's plan of atonement, and this constitutes in addition to our theodicy, he says, is to make us dissatisfied with our state of separation from him, and not by miraculously altering our values or by subjecting us to illusion or by causing us suffering. that has no natural consequence with our separation from him, but simply by allowing us to live with the natural consequences of the separation, and by making it as difficult as possible for us to delude ourselves about the kind of world we live in, a hideous world, much of whose hideousness is quite plainly traceable to the inability of humans to govern themselves to or order their own lives. And he concludes by saying, let us expand our theodicy. An essential part of God's plan of atonement for separated humanity is for human beings to perceive that a natural consequence of human beings attempting to order their own lives is a hideous world, and a world that's hideous not by only his standards, but by the very standards they themselves accept, by God's standards, but by their humans' own standards. The world's hideous. The gist is, Robert, as you're catching, is that if God took out all this evil in the world, then people would no longer seek God for relationship. One of the main reasons to come to God is because you see that the world is not where you put your hope. And that's relevant because seeking fellowship with God is a great good, I would argue, if theism's true. Does that make sense?
I am withholding objection until number 11.
But it makes sense. You get it at least.
I understand what you're saying. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, excellent. The rest of these are going to be a lot quicker. Love bonds that are forged in suffering are great goods. Robin Collins makes a big deal about how you get to carry these bonds of love into eternity. When I help someone who's suffering, and there's a connection, a great good that couldn't have existed without that suffering. And not only is it a great good, but it's an eternally lasting good. At least on the hypothesis that there's an afterlife.
Yeah, number 5 is the most convincing yet. Sure.
Oh, cool. Excellent. Next, there's a good of what's called solidarity with Christ in suffering. 6 is that there's a great good about evil conquering stories. So certain true stories which essentially involve evil are good things in the world. You can imagine a world without any stories like this, and that world would take a hit in terms of its value. Those would be gone in a world without evil. A natural, knowable order.
I missed number 6. Can you do that one more time?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
the
6.
The one you just did. Solidarity. Okay. I don't understand what you mean.
We're actually on 7. 7 is that true evil conquering stories are good. And the idea, in a world without evil, suppose that, there's just no familiarity with evil, we would actually lose all cinema. I mean, Batman Begins and all of our favorite movies have elements of evil conquering.
Oh, okay. This is the yin-yang thing that I was accusing you of before.
Yeah, and when you think about it, all of these have some yin-yang to them. That's the point of the theodicy.
And 6 was suffering brings solidarity. Before that was love, and before that was suffering leads to God.
That's right. You got it.
I'm with you.
And now we're on another good, that there's a knowable natural order. So a universe evolving through time in this regular, predictable, intelligible way is a good thing. There's actually a lot of philosophy has convinced me to a great degree that God greatly values discovery, scientific discovery, teamwork in pursuing these types of knowledge, these knowledge pursuits. And I want to say that this is relevant because it's not clear at all that there even exists a possible universe which unfolds as elegantly as ours does, in accordance with scientifically intelligible laws. It's not clear that there's even possibly a universe that unfolds that way, which does not also result in occasional harm to creatures who are born into it. So, the laws that govern our universe are so elegant, and they're not just elegant, they're discoverable. We can actually find them, and it didn't have to be that way. God could create a world that, every time someone fires a bullet, it turns into a marshmallow. And, he can do these types of things that result in the world having no suffering. But as soon as you do that type of thing, the more of that you do, the more incredibly complex physics you have to introduce into the world. And soon the world, you can't even learn about the world. There's none of that scientific endeavor. It gets destroyed in the process of preventing evil. And if it gets destroyed, then once again you've lost a great good. Not saying this good is worth all the evil in the world, but it's definitely something that we would have lost. It goes into the equation. Next is being able to sacrifice to promote the good in order to get these heroes, heroism, who make sacrifices to make things better, ultimately requires or risks or requires or results in suffering. So sacrifices often involve suffering, whether it's emotional or physical, and the greatness of these people and their would-be acts depends on how much they sacrifice and how much better they made things. And so again, this is something that would be lost in a world without any suffering or evil. Last two. One is in order to be, this is related, in order to be of use to people in need, you're going to need to risk, require, or ultimately get things that result in suffering. We are of most use to others when others most need our help, emotionally and physically. And others most need our help in the midst of suffering or a real danger of it. And so there's a whole, again, for each of these, there's a whole article, but there's a whole lot of quotes and people talking about how this would all be gone in a world without evil.
How is that one different from 6, solidarity?
Because this one makes no reference to Christ at all. Whereas the solidarity with Christ in suffering has to do specifically with your relationship with God in Christ and being able to know Christ on a deeper level, which, again, I know you don't believe that right now, but that part of the theodicy reasoning would be spending time to convince you that this could be a good thing.
Yeah, and I'm at least I'm familiar with what you mean by solidarity with Christ. So 10 would be solidarity with others.
It's not necessarily solid. If anything, it would be that would be closer to the one about love bonds forged in suffering, solidarity and suffering with others. This one it doesn't talk about necessarily the good of others being benefited. It's talking about the good of you being able to be a hero, you having the badge yourself. If I strip you of all opportunities to serve others, it's not just that others don't get goods. It's that you lose out on the ability to be of use to others in need. Okay. And for many humans, being of use to others, whether they're an old person and they need help, and you get to help that person and feel good along the way, the vast majority of that would be lost in a world without suffering. And so you lose something out. You, the person who's helping, are missing out on something in this world without suffering. The final one, which everybody's thought of at least briefly, which is the most yin-yang of all, is that appreciating, or at least more appreciating, the absence and elimination of evil and suffering. That's a great good. And again, especially in the context of eternity, you get to carry this with you and enjoy it for eternity. It gets more and more valuable over time, unto infinity. And this is relevant because we can only become acquainted as we are with suffering and its elimination if such suffering occurs. So Justin McBriar says that, and there's something plausible about the principle. It's very hard to see how we would ever fully appreciate health without illness, wealth without poverty, and love without hate. Okay,
how does 11, and I'm not saying that it doesn't, I'm just trying to understand, how does 11 differ from 7, which was kind of like the yin-yang thing?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 was the true evil conquering stories one?
Yeah, you gotta have evil to have good.
Just to confirm, this is the true evil conquering stories one? That was what you're comparing it to?
Sure.
Okay. Well, no, I don't think the last one has to do with stories. In this case, there's a beauty of a story. Again, I mentioned Batman Begins, but almost any of those superhero movies or any of the emotional stories where someone overcomes a kind of hurdle, which inevitably is a kind of evil. There's a goodness in itself associated with an evil conquering story. It's not that the person becomes familiar with suffering and then is overjoyed that they aren't facing it. That's the last one. That's the appreciating heaven is good one. It's like, I can truly appreciate this because I've experienced the worse. And as a result, me having a time of hardness allows me for eternity to enjoy the absence of that of that pain and suffering all the more. So my eternity is much better as a result of a transient temporal period of hardship. That's the last one. And that's completely different than me being able for eternity to say, look at this really cool story. This is the kind of story I can tell my kids and people get joy out of it. There's a goodness in the story itself, a beauty in the story itself that people seek when they read literature. It's not that they're being able to compare. It's that there's this new thing. There's the story itself, and a world without story would be a loss.
Absolutely. So right off the bat, the majority of these, let me see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ow, you almost got majority. But we'll say close to half of these, I agree with you 100%. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm with you on every one of those points. Maybe even number 5, sure, that suffering can lead to love and that sort of thing. My problem is the last 5 you mentioned could be useful with or without a God. The last 5 you mentioned, as I understand them, now granted you've put a lot more time and effort into studying these. I'm sure you've got a whole desk right while we're talking. Your desk is probably full with just pages full of references to each of these points. So I've only heard a small summary of these, and I'm already going, wow, it's almost like I do YouTube videos sometimes to try to promote the podcast. And so I'll get objections from people that are like, that video was trash. That's why I didn't even watch it. And I'm like, what? Wait, thanks, jerk. But still, but I kind of feel that way a little bit. But it's like the last 5 would be true with or without a God, wouldn't they? They kind of just explain how you got to have a little good with a little bad for this whole process to work. And that could exist to an atheist or a theist.
Yeah, the goal, remember, is I'm not on the offense right now. I'm not trying to make a case for God at all. What I'm doing is I'm playing defense. I understand that you have a particular kind of evidence against God's existence, and the evidence says, man, if there were this, good God out there as proposed, this greatest possible being, then I wouldn't expect to see evil like this in the world. And I came back and I said, okay, if this is evidence against God, it shouldn't be very strong evidence. And let me give you 2 reasons. One is that you're limited in your ability to assess whether there could be morally justifying reasons for God's permitting this type of suffering in the world.
But I mean, that would apply to everything. My inability to assess anything, even like brain in a vat hard solipsism or pink unicorns or particle and physics, and I mean it wouldn't matter what example you gave. I mean your first premise there would apply to literally every single thing. I am limited in my understanding, so obviously if we're talking about an omniscient being, then at any point you could do a special pleading argument and say, yeah, but he knows the best thing.
Well, this is especially a case where it's going to be hard for you to assess. I think you're right. There's a degree of humility we should come into all questions, but there's a whole lot of humility you should come into the question of whether there can be any morally sufficient, morally justifying good for a particular evil that you're looking at. And that's because of things like the butterfly effect.
Well, but that's not my claim. It's not whether or not, and I think that's what the last 5 are whether or not there is a moral justification for evil, or at least an explanation as to how evil could exist in reality without it contradicting with the good. And I agree with those, but those don't, and your last point, have nothing to do with God.
I think you're, just to clarify, I'm trying to figure out why you've decreased the likelihood in your mind of God's existence. You said that partially you think that you're more confident, at least a little more confident than you would have been otherwise, that God doesn't exist, because if God did exist, then more of this suffering would be gone. And I'm saying, actually, you shouldn't drop your confidence that much. This isn't very good evidence against God, and the reason is because I know you see suffering out here, but there could be good reasons for why God allows for this suffering. It's really hard to make an argument against God on the basis of suffering.
So you're saying the last 5 that I'm contesting could be the reasons that God allowed it, but to do that we got to assume God.
No, you don't have to assume God at all.
Well, why couldn't we just say that the last ones are that's just how stuff works, with or without a God?
Let's think about let's see if we can use a different analogy so that we can understand it. a different way.
You're being extremely patient, and I appreciate it.
No, you don't worry at all. Yeah, I'm happy to go through it. But let's say that we have a person on trial, and in this trial, we're trying to say, this person, performed an act that was wrong. They left their kids at the house unattended. And we're bringing these accusations against them. I don't know if there's a specific law of doing that for too long or something, but now in order to charge this person as guilty, you're going to need to make a case against them. You're going to say that this person's bad, blameworthy, which is analogous to what we're doing with God. And the question is the defense attorney would come up and he'd kind of say, look, we can't interrogate this person. They're still gone, you might say. But listen, there's all sorts of reasons for why the person might not be there that would render the person innocent. For all we know, this person has been abducted themselves. For all we know, and he goes through the list of things that we haven't established yet before we declare this person guilty. And then he would sit down. And I think that the jury, depending on the scenario, the jury could be convinced, maybe there does seem to be a case against this person's innocence, but we don't have enough information yet to really conclude that this person's guilty. In the same way, I'm coming in saying, look, here are all these – I understand you're looking at the evil in the world and you're saying if God were good, he would do this. I'm the defense attorney. I'm standing up and I'm saying, look, there could be reasons for why God's permitting this. Let me go through several of them with you. I'm not saying that he is – I'm not assuming that he's innocent. I'm not assuming that a good God exists in this. I'm just saying that this is not good evidence against the existence of a good God.
I feel like you're lining me up as the prosecutor in this courtroom. Is that a good way of understanding?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Dude, that's totally shifting the burden of proof. Come on. You're the prosecutor. You're making the claim.
In this case, we're on your spectrum of belief. When you say that the likelihood of God's existence has taken a hit, when you're saying that I might have been holding the likelihood of God's existence to be 30%, but after considering this evidence of suffering, I've dropped down to more like 1%. What you're doing is in your own head. This isn't about who's making claims or whatnot. We're just jumping into your head here. And psychologically, what's happened is in your head is you don't
want to go there. Lots of naked stuff in there. But okay, if I'm accepting the role of prosecutor in this scenario,
you have an evidence against God.
We're not going for beyond reasonable doubt. We're just going for preponderance of evidence. Is that fair?
Yeah. You have a case. You have a case in your head, and in the case, you have at least some evidence against God's existence, namely suffering in the world. Suffering like this, you might initially think, is really good evidence that God doesn't exist. And so you're like, okay, I would have been, 30% confident at least that God doesn't exist, but now I'm pretty confident, I think there's only a 1% chance because, man, this suffering wouldn't exist if God did.
All but then you think about it. In that case, I would say the last 5 I accept. Mm-hmm. However, the first 6 I reject. And once again, to be a little more clear, the last 5 I accept on terms that I don't really believe that they prove your argument. It would almost be like as if I was saying some kind of generality just about life itself, and you say, well, that doesn't argue against me or argue for me. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, it does one more than the other, and you're like, okay, but if it applies to everything, then it kind of applies to nothing. That would be my objection, but I'll give you the last 5. The first 6, though, seem to focus on kind of 2 things: free will and relationships. Would that be a good way to compress 6 down to 2? Would that be fair? Like I'm not leading you down a path to destruction here. I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, there's elements of that in each of them, but I don't know.
The first 2 are about your decisions and how they affect your life, and you have to be able to make decisions if we're going to accept terms of free will and not be determinists and Sam Harris, which is kind of a pain in the butt. I can't argue against it, but nobody wants to have that conversation. Anyway, and then you got atonement, you got suffering leads to God, suffering leads to love, solidarity with people in Christ, that sort of thing. So, I mean, with each, the first ones to me seem like they're more about philosophy, and then the latter 4 seem like they're more like, this is how you promote relationships and passion and how we get along with one another, even how we might get along with Jesus Christ himself. Am I getting closer?
I mean, you're hitting on some truths, but yeah, there's a lot of complexity along the way. So I don't know if it's good to simplify them, but to simplify them in that way. In
all fairness, you probably simplified them as much as you could already, and now I'm like, let's simplify them further, and you're like, no, I tried that. That's how I got to 11, Robert. So, fair enough. On the free will ones, though, and I recognize that you're not making a claim for a deity of the Bible deity, the one that would be described in the gospel and that sort of thing. But in respect to that, to just kind of take a step aside, because we both know that you're a Christian, we both know that you believe Christ died for your sins and all have come short of the glory of God, yada, yada, yada. No intentional blasphemy there. I'm just, So,
sure.
Wouldn't you agree, though, that there's free will in heaven, and that even Satan doesn't have the free will to reject God in terms of knowledge?
I actually don't think that there's free will in heaven, or at least not moral free will, which is the kind of free will that we're calling attention to in the first one. I think that people in heaven have already made their free will choice. They've decided to rest. They've made the choice on earth to rest in their decision to give their free will to God. They're saying, God, I know that as long as I have my moral free will, my own, I'm going to mess things up. And so I'm not going to fit in the coming world that you're bringing that is going to be sin-free. God is going to eliminate all evil on the Christian worldview. And we have the opportunity, this is a big part of the gospel, to not only have our current sins wiped away, but to engage in a transformation where we can become heavenly, permanently good. And God doesn't want to just force someone into, being transformed in that way. It has to be their own free will decision. But once they've made that free will decision to be transformed, to be godly, to be perfectly good, then they get to be freely good in heaven while never having the subsequent opportunity.
How could you be freely good if you don't have the option to do a line off a hooker's butt? You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not trying to be crass. I was trying to think of like the dirtiest thing I could imagine, which that lets you know just how vanilla and cis I am, if that's as dirty as I can get. But anyway, like that seems like, wouldn't that be immoral to remove your freedom?
I don't think so. Not if you made the free decision to give yourself over to that transformation. I do think it would be wrong, or at least it would lose the value if God simply created you transformed so that now you can't freely choose to actually be part of God's program. That would be a lot more robotic. But instead, what you do is you have a time on earth where you get to see your own sin. You get to say, I'm not fit for a perfect world, but God, you can make me fit. With my free will that you've given me, I choose to turn it over to you so that it is my free decision to be perfect in heaven. And God can enact your free will choice. And in that sense, it's a free will choice for you to be perfect henceforward.
I think you might have just stepped into a big pile of contradictions there.
Okay.
And let me just spout it out, and you tell me where I'm misunderstanding you. But
sure.
It doesn't make sense to me. Your first two, and what you say throughout the whole thing, free will is kind of represented, but maybe that was my mischaracterization of the beginning ones were more about free will. But at least we could say within these 11 points, you were arguing that it is moral for us to have free will. However, whenever you're talking about heaven, you're saying that we don't have free will. However, it is still moral for God to deny us free will. And that seems like a major contradiction. You're saying we have to have evil, because if you don't have evil, then you don't have free will. But then in heaven, you say, well, we don't have to have free will, and that's still moral to do so. I'm not following that one.
I wonder if maybe this would help. When I say that free agency in a moral arena is good, free agency, the ability to choose to do wrong, is a good thing. I say that even in the duration of heaven, even when people don't have the free will anymore to choose wrong, I will still say that the ability to choose right or wrong is good. We just won't have that particular good in heaven anymore.
But premise 8 was, and once I'm paraphrasing, so correct where I'm wrong here, but bad couldn't be possible, or good couldn't be possible unless there was bad.
Are you talking about maybe being of use to those in need? Which one are you looking at? 1, 2, 3, 4.
I was at 8.
8 is a noble natural order, so that can't be what you mean.
Perhaps, but at least the latter 5 kind of had this theme of, you got to have a little sugar to get a little sour kind of feel, right? And what I'm saying is, if that's the case, then how could you call good if there isn't a bad? How could you say that there's only the yin if there's not the yang, or the yang if there's not the yin?
Yeah, I don't think that is representative of any of the last 5. The closest would be the appreciating heaven one. That would be the closest to that idea, and that's where you can only recognize that, or you can only really appreciate heaven once you've tasted the sourness of non-heaven, of suffering, and that incidentally entails that you have to have this Janus one half and then the other half. You have to have both.
I see what you're saying. What about an infant that only lived for a short amount of time? Would that also apply to the infant?
No, that I don't think. I doubt it. I doubt that infant would derive any particular benefit from that 11th point. But
So would the infant exist in an eternal inability to be moral?
No, I'm not saying that people need a period of suffering in the world in order to be moral.
But you're saying that we need a period of suffering in the world in order for God to be moral.
No, not saying that either.
So God could be moral even if we didn't have suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
yeah,
God
absolutely.
is moral even if we do have suffering.
Yeah, if there are morally sufficient reasons that God has for allowing suffering, then right, there's no case against God there either.
I see what you're saying.
I'm not saying that God, there's a couple points there. I mean, maybe you want to say, well, look, if God existed, God would do the best possible thing, and maybe the best possible thing is this other action over here for there never to be any evil at all. That's incidentally that was related. At the beginning I said that there were 3 particular defenses. That's actually related to the first thing to point out. I'm not sure. Sorry, that's too complex. I'm just confusing things now.
No, not at all. In fact, I appreciate you keeping it easy for us. But my problem is, does God need these 11 things? I think is where I was trying to lead with that. Is he good no matter what? Is he capable of having is he capable of being moral even if he didn't have suffering on the earth?
Yeah, I mean, if God created a world without any free will, if he just created a bunch of people straight in heaven, I think that would be good too.
Right.
I incidentally don't think it would be as good. I think
that would certainly line up with our understanding of omniscience itself, that he is all powerful. But I think that at the same time, while that makes me want to agree with you, I'm following along, I'm with you. That also makes me start to think once again, hey, there's a problem here. If he is omnipotent, and he is all powerful, why would he have to follow these kinds of rules? Why couldn't he create a world where there is free will, but there's no suffering? Why couldn't he create a world where there's benefits of our relationships or atonement, or you don't necessarily have to have solidarity with Christ? Why couldn't he create a world that didn't necessarily need to have heroes? You could still have a hero without there being suffering. You could still have good and bad stories without there being suffering. Why, if he's omnipotent, why does he have to follow these rules that you and I would just say, whether we believe in God or not, that's just basic reality? Why does he have to conform himself to that? He's all powerful.
I disagree. I think that as we go down this list, you're going to come across things that logically either require the good to be significantly reduced, or alternatively to be eliminated entirely. They're because they'd be logically incompatible.
But you're basing that on how we understand reality itself.
Well, no. So, like, for instance,
we're not basing that on a maximally great God that could defy even your list of 11.
No, I don't think that God can, for instance, make a square circle. I don't think that God can instantiate contradictions. And in this case, I'm talking about goods that logically entail or require suffering.
So there are things that God can't do?
Yeah, exactly. Not even God can get some of these goods without the presence of suffering. So, for example,
would it be fair to say that he is not omnipotent, if that is true?
No. At least in philosophy of religion, as omnipotence is defined, is the ability to do whatever is logically possible, to have all logically possible power. So anything that can be done, God can do.
That's ridiculous. You are creating scenarios that there is just no possible way to object to them, because like at each objection you say, well, whenever I say this, I don't mean to incorporate any possible objection. So if I say, okay, he can do anything, yeah, well, can he not have suffering and still have the good that you're talking about? Well, no. Okay, so he can't do anything. Well, when I say anything, I mean he can do anything except for the thing I'm saying that he can't say. Like, if I were to use the same logic with anything else we were talking about, whether it be unicorns or quarks or whatever smaller than a quark baby, as it were. And then, what was the third one? Solipsism. Like, if I was to use the same kind of argument with any of these, wouldn't there be some point where you go, Robert, I think you're special pleading?
No, you might have to go a little bit more slowly to say that again. I'm missing it.
Like, if you were to say, okay, so there is a scenario where there's a pink unicorn, and I say, yeah, but how could it be pink if it's invisible? To use your analogy or something, you're like, well, okay, but in this reality, it has a different application. And I'm like, yeah, but you see what I'm saying? Like, it seems like at each step of the way, even if I'm like, so you can do anything, you're like, well, you can't. He can only do the things that he can do, but he can't make a square a circle. It's very hard for me to follow along where each claim that I reject, you say, yeah, but that claim has all these kinds of contingencies and special, quid pro quo kind of thing, or quid pro quo. You know what I mean?
Can I read you some quotes from atheist philosophers on this?
Sure.
Yeah. So but here's what Michael Martin. These are atheist philosophy professors. He says, if God is omnipotent, he could have actualized any logically possible world. That's what it's understood as. Anthony Kinney, professor at Oxford, says a being is omnipotent if it has every power which it is logically possible to possess. Aquinas' own account is tantamount to the proposal that the omnipotence of God is the ability to do whatever is logically possible. J.L. Mackie says a logical contradiction is not a state of affairs which is supremely difficult to produce, but only a form of words which fails to describe any state of affairs. So I think he'll give an example. So to say, as we are now saying, that God is omnipotent means God can do or make to be X for any X, provided doing X or making X is not logically impossible. Would be to say that if God is omnipotent, every coherently describable activity or production is within his power. And finally, Patrick Grimm says, here Aquinas' response has been influential. What omnipotence requires is the ability to perform any task, and create a square circle does not specify a genuine task. Quite generally, it can be held contradictory specifications fail to specify anything, precisely because they're contradictory, rather than specifying some particularly contradictory type. If so, contradictory task specifications fail to designate genuine tasks, and thus fail to designate tasks required of any omnipotent being. With regard to contradictory specifications, at least, God and omnipotence are off the hook. So, Robert, here's the idea. Let me give you an example. We can refute God right now. Let's do this. Can God ooga booga wooga laga looga? If God exists, can God do that?
As silly as that sounded, I like where your argument's going. It doesn't make sense, so therefore, how could we even make an argument? Like, the question itself doesn't make sense. So I'm with you 100%. God could not ooga booga booga.
Right. It's a pseudo-task is what it's called in philosophy of religion. And omnipotent beings aren't required to do pseudo-tasks. And when you say something like, if God existed, God could create a square circle, that's just that's a pseudo-task. I mean, that's not something that is within the realm of actual things that can be done. But anything that's logically possible, if God existed, God would be able to do those things.
As long as we're saying omnipotence is maximally strong.
The ability to bring about any logically possible state of affairs. Anything that's not nonsense.
That makes a lot more sense. I still feel like it's kind of like a rope-a-dope. Like you're saying, like he can do anything, but then, while I'm looking at that, you're like, yeah, but I didn't really mean anything. But I see what you're saying, and your analogy did explain it a lot better, so I appreciate your patience on that. I want to ask, is it logically possible to have knowledge of God and therefore not have free will to believe in him or not? That's what knowledge would be. If you have knowledge of something, you do not have free will to believe it. If I know there's a sun, I don't get to say I don't believe in the sun unless, I have some kind of like mental impairment, right? So.
Yeah, and even if you like freely decided to not have knowledge of God, that doesn't mean you have the power to enact what you've freely chosen. So
fantastic.
I think you can,
we're right on the same page. So if I lacked the free will to know whether or not God exists, could I still reject him?
Real quick, I think you can freely choose to believe. You can choose what you want to believe. You can decide that I want to believe or not believe that thing, but you don't have the power to enact what you've freely chosen. So I find myself with the belief.
I don't mean to interrupt because I'm trying to make a point. I'm interrupting to ask for clarification. Mm-hmm. You choose what you believe.
You can decide that you want to believe something, but you don't have the power. I can't, in the colloquial sense, I don't have the power to bring myself to believe that there's a pink elephant in this room. Even if I can choose in my head, I choose to believe that there's a pink elephant in this room right now, and yet I can't do it. Even though I choose to, I lack the power to make it happen.
Which seems to contradict your claim.
How so?
Because you don't get to choose your beliefs.
Let's back up. When I say – because sometimes I've explained this to other people. I'll say I can't choose to believe that there's a pink elephant in the room. What I mean technically when I'm saying that is I can choose – like I can decide that I want to believe a pink elephant is in the room. That's what I mean when in the technical sense.
Right, but you can't actually believe it by will.
And then I can that whole complex statement I can simplify by just saying I can't choose to believe a pink elephant is in the room. I mean technically I can choose it, but but I can't bring it about.
You cannot choose it. You didn't believe it. You either did or you did not believe. And you might want to believe it, but you still don't believe it. Like I want to believe, I'm the handsomest guy my wife has ever met. Mm-hmm. But then I talked to a guy like Blaine Giunta and it ruined it for me. But I'm just kidding around. But I'm just saying you're very handsome. But anyway, no. So it got weird. So. But no, my point here is you can't choose your beliefs, Blake. That's just not how it works.
We have the same view here. So you and I are doxastic volunteerists. You and I agree that I can't bring myself to believe what I just, something just because I want to believe it. We're getting into some of the technical semantics here. Okay. I think that it's most technical, in the most technical verbiage, although I might, to a casual person say, no, I can't choose to believe there's a pink elephant in here. And I think that's the sense that you're doing it, and I agree with you. Yeah. I'm telling you at the most technical sense, if you're talking to a philosopher, you'd have to say, okay, I can choose to believe that there's a pink elephant there. It just wouldn't work.
Okay, fair enough. And at that point, I would have problems with the majority of my objection to your list of 11 in the terms of free will. Satan, according to Scripture, has knowledge of God. Satan does not have the option of free will in terms of whether or not he believes God exists or not. However, he's still capable and does reject him. And in that sense, I think that throws a wrench in your whole idea that free will is necessary and suffering is necessary for us to turn to God. I mean, is that a fair criticism?
I don't think so. I think you might be conflating the topic under discussion with the topic of divine hiddenness and the ability to choose whether to believe God exists or not. In this case, we're not talking about the freedom to believe. We're talking about the freedom to make the freedom to behave morally. So I can choose to steal or to give to a charity. These are the types of free choices I'm talking about. And in the absence of evil in the world, you wouldn't have these types of – you wouldn't have this moral arena. You wouldn't be able to make those free choices.
Is it immoral to not believe in God?
I wouldn't say that. I don't know. I'd have to research that more. I'm not sure.
Enough,
but my
and I kind of feel like I'm tripping you. But if it wasn't, correct me. You know, you'd be like, Robert, that's not really what I meant. That's okay. Like my goal isn't. But just along the same thinking, if it's not immoral to be an atheist, wouldn't it be immoral to give me eternal punishment because I'm an atheist?
Oh wow! So that's definitely that's a whole brand new topic. If you want to jump into that topic, we can. But I just want to make sure very clear that we've stepped outside of one topic and we're moving into a new one.
Can we save it for next time? Because that's actually, I think you are one of the few people that I could ask that question to, and whether we agree at the end of the conversation next time or not, I think I would at least understand your position much better than if I had asked somebody else. And
I'd love to answer it. Let me go ahead. I just want to be very clear that let's say I answer this and it's a bad answer. It doesn't influence the previous discussion. So
fair enough.
Let me jump into it. And so the question, just to repeat, is would a good God, specifically the Christian God who implements judgment and all of this, how could a good God condemn someone for simply lacking belief? Is that the heart of the issue?
Yes, with the contingency that we accept that we don't get to choose our beliefs, which we already admitted to, and also that not believing in God isn't necessarily immoral. So now we're facing something where we have to say you had no option except to burn in hell, and you did nothing wrong to warrant burning in hell. If you would accept those two, I think you'd have a hard time defending it, but I would understand if you would say, I want to back up on those 2 points before I continue with the hell defense.
Yeah, and starting out, let me say, by the way, that I think that in a debate just using the Bible, I think annihilationists come out strongest. These are people who believe that only believers get eternal life, and non-believers.
You're 100% right, yeah.
Yeah, non-believers, I think they do suffer for a bit, but they ultimately are annihilated. They're the ones that don't get eternal life. So I don't hold to the what's called the traditional view of hell. I don't think they do well in debates.
Yeah, I had this dude come to my house. I was like knocking on the door, and it was I want to say Jehovah's Witness, and he came in, and I was like, yeah. And anytime those guys come in, I'm like, please sit down. Let's open up some Bibles. What version are we doing? Because I'm a big geek with that, right? And then I go through this whole defense about why hell is immoral, and I must have talked for a good 30 minutes. I kind of felt bad for taking up all his time. And then after that, he's like, JWs don't believe any of that stuff. I'm like, oh, yes, I will gladly take the track that you have for me, and I'm going to go ahead and read your literature. Thank you for your time, sir. Like, I had nothing. But anyway, I'm sorry. Just made me laugh.
But there's still some bite to your question, because even then I still believe that people are condemned, and they would have not faced any condemnation.
Yeah, like you believe they go to a literal fiery hell, right?
Yeah, or okay. I haven't decided if there's fire there. I don't know yet, because it's described as outer darkness as well, right? I mean, there's sort of different descriptions of it, so I don't know.
God can do anything.
Sure. Well, not logical contradictions, but yes. Anyways, let's go to your question. How can a good God condemn someone in any sense, punish them in any sense for simply lacking a belief in something when they can't choose their own beliefs? That seems kind of wrong, right? That's the thrust.
Just for the record, I'll let this be the last point, because I am already recognizing, as many atheists have told me about you that have talked to you before, you are the nicest dude, and you are going to let me totally monopolize your entire day. So I'll let this be the last point, and if possible, I would love to talk to you again in the future, but No rebuttal coming from me on this at all. Please make your argument for why God would send a lovely, precious thing like my beautiful daughter to everlasting suffering in hell. I'm sorry, I made that worse than what you meant. But anyway, I'm trying to say last point. I'd love to talk to you again, but please go ahead.
Yeah, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for chatting with me. I'd love to continue the conversation. So yeah, that's the worry that we're having here, and this is this can be a big misunderstanding of the Christian view of what they call the gospel. On the Christian worldview, which is what we're talking about here, we're asking if it's coherent. A non-believer is not punished for their lack of belief. On the Christian worldview, everyone, including me, is guilty before God, due for God's punishment as a result of wrongdoings, of lying and stealing and raping and all, the list. We all have things that we're guilty of, and we haven't lived up to God's standards, again, on the Christian hypothesis. Now, it's true that God has made a provision for sinners. So on the Christian view, we're due for God's judgment, not for lack of belief, but because of these evils we've done. We're not fit for the coming perfect world. But God loves people. And as a result, he's made a provision to clean their slate so that now they are made clean. And that provision is a gift. Now, you may say, well, it's not fair that some people have heard of this gift and received it, and others haven't heard of it and received it. And this is where I would come back and I'd say that, okay, you're right, it's not fair, but we're talking about justice. It's kind of like a really good person coming in and giving a good gift to some people who doesn't give it to all people. These other people receive justice. But whether God deals with someone justly or he gives them a gift of mercy, in both cases, I would argue God is not guilty of anything. He's not done anything wrong. He's just given a gift to some and given pure justice to others. And so, long answer short, God punishes a person for their sin, not their lack of belief. And he's just extended a grace to some undeserving sinners, is the idea.
I'm Carolina. I hope we can get into hell in our next discussion, and I want to ask you a lot of other things at that time. But between now and then, for the folks that are waiting for that, could you tell us about beliefmap.org one more time, and how maybe people can find you or talk to you or ask you some of these complex questions?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm on Facebook, and I'll chat with you. If you have a question, again, this is my ministry. In my mind, I'm not. You're not inconveniencing me. I like to talk about this stuff. I feel that this is a way for me to serve both you, anybody that wants to talk, and God. So don't hesitate to talk to me. My name is Blake Giunta. The last name is spelled Giunta. And I run this website called beliefmap.org, which is an extension of my own quest for truth and desire to equip people with information so that they can get answers as quickly in the most fun way that they can. So check it out. It is fun. It navigates like a conversation. And that's it. So beliefmap.org, and you have my Facebook name. So feel free to send me a message and we'll chat.
I am so happy to have had the opportunity to talk to Mr. Giunta today. Great guy and a lot of fun. Whew! That was heavy, wasn't it? Jesus Christ. Let me know how I did by hitting me up on Twitter at Right to Reason 1 or on our Facebook page, The Right to Reason. If you're not a social media person, you can always get a hold of me through the website, therighttoreason.com. I'm going to let Mr. Como play us out from The Lost State of Mind. Before I go, remember to stand up for your most important right. You already know what that is. I'll talk to you next week.